Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 30th of June, and today we're going to be doing a full frontline update. But before I begin, I just want to tell you guys that I'm planning to do a Twitter space either tomorrow or Saturday, and I want to make these Twitter spaces a regular occasion. So it would be just talking about the Ukraine war and geopolitics in general, and then you guys could ask me questions if you would like. So I just want to know from you guys like what times would be good for that, as just so I can gauge the amount of people that actually be showing up because I'm actually really excited to do this, and I plan to do it throughout the entire course of the summer. But anyway, let's get into the situation in Ukraine, starting off with Kherson, where the Ukrainians do still maintain their brief, very small bridgehead. I call it like a incipient bridgehead because it's still forming and it's still receiving more supplies and more men are moving into that area. And so it's not an actual bridgehead, it's just a small sector where Ukrainians have four positions with reconnaissance that goes back and forth at night. So the main Ukrainian concentration in this area is just to the south of the town of, or not the town, the bridge, the Antonovsky Bridge. And then they're in the town of Dachi, which is this town filled with these rural dachas, and it's directly adjacent to the Dnieper River. And so the main Ukrainian concentration is in the square, but there may be Ukrainian forces a bit to the west in the rest of the town of Dachi that are over there, but in much smaller numbers. So I don't know the exact status of what's going on in this part of the Dnieper River and the coastal area. So I'm going to have to find sources to clarify that situation. But they do definitely have 100 or more men in this part of the area around the river. Now let's go to this announcement by Vladimir Saldo, who's the head of the Russian administration in Kherson region that they still control. They still control about 60% of the region. And so he said that all residents of the coastal territory of the Kherson region and all of the civil institutions will be subject to an evacuation of a strip of terrain 15 kilometers to the east of the right bank of the Dnieper River. So that would include all of the positions in this like red highlighted area over here. So all the civilians there would be evacuated to cities further to the east. And so there are not many cities or towns that they could be moved into in Kherson itself. So I'd expect most of them would be evacuated to like Crimea or to Russia proper. Really the only city outside of that 15-kilometer strip of land is Henichesk, which is currently the civilian capital of the Russian-controlled region. And so the reason why all these civilians are being moved out from towns like Novokakhovka and Oleshki is because although there's still been a lot of flooding and a lot of fighting in these areas, a lot of civilians are still in there. And the Russians, they want to be able to fight most effectively without having to deal with civilians being caught in the crossfire. And the reason they're doing this now is probably because they're seeing the uptick in Ukrainian activity, trying to establish a bridgehead, sending these reconnaissance forces across the river, and actually directly threatening Russian hubs of attack and now defense in towns like Oleshki, which is very close to the river. And so you can't have civilians over there. It makes it much harder to operate, and you need the living quarters. And so definitely this makes sense, but it's also good for the civilians to be out of there, because I do expect there to be a massive increase in shelling at the very least, but also it could be small arms fire fighting on the ground. So we're going to have to see what Ukraine does in that regard. Let's move on to the situation in Zaporizhzhia, which is very interesting. I'm also going to be talking about the weather in Zaporizhzhia because that's also important to this. So starting off with Piatikhatki, no changes to the front line. The only thing that we can report is that the Ukrainians are now in a stage where they're trying to collect some of the dead and wounded from the fields around Piatikhatki. So you have just like small crews going around trying to evacuate those people. No attempts at an attack towards Zherebianki today. And so that's a change in Ukrainian activity in that area. Then the Ukrainians did actually continue their offensive activities to the north of Robotyne, this time with the 65th Mechanized Brigade, which is stationed around Kamyanske, but I suppose that some of their battalions may be around the Orikhiv sector, and so they conducted this attack. This time they did not utilize any sort of support from armored vehicles, so no M113s, no M1017s, no strikers, none of these armored fighting vehicles, which are very important for providing fire supports, especially when you're going into this enemy territory where you have fortified Russian positions all around, especially in the trenches that I have marked in black over here. And then there's no way to protect the forces as they're going through the open fields and then dropping them off at a certain position. So the infantry here was on foot and they tried to conduct that attack towards Zaporizhzhia, but it was quickly pushed back by the Russian artillery, mortar crews, and the Russian Air Force that was conducting sorties in the area. And so there is no Ukrainian gains in this area. Their attacks so far have been repelled. And so a lot of the reason why the attacks in this area have been stalling recently is because of the weather. Now, a lot of it also has to do with Russia's capabilities, but let's look at the weather forecast. It has been pretty rainy over the past few days in this area. A very high level of precipitation. It's been cloudy in some areas as well. But like, look tomorrow, June 30th, or it's actually today now. You could see the chance of precipitation. You could see that it's going to be thunder showers actually. And then look, same thing on July 1st. There's a period where it's most likely not going to be raining or anything else like that from July 2nd all the way to July 8th. So that gives less than a week of a window of opportunity for Ukrainian attack in this area, which I'm going to get to. But again, you want to sustain that attack. You want to continue to capitalize on it. So you don't want to have in between an assault just one day where out of nowhere the rain appears and then you get bogged down and you can't resupply. Because there's definitely going to be rain on July 9th. It looks like it's also going to be lightning. Same thing on July 14th. So really all of June, July is just filled with these different days out of nowhere where you have this rain. It's very bad for the Ukrainian supply lines in this area. A lot of the larger vehicles get bogged down, especially because they're usually going through open fields. They're not really going through paved roads. There's not many paved roads in a lot of the areas where we're seeing most of the fighting. And so it is a difficulty for the Ukrainians to sustain those attacks when they have this very muddy terrain. And so they're going to have to find a way around that. Maybe they're just going to have to wait it out for a few days and then they'll just launch it on July 3rd just because there's going to give them a very small window of opportunity to begin an attack in very sunny conditions without any sort of rain. That's certainly a possibility. And we do know that the Ukrainians do want to continue and begin a new push in this area after their initial pushes from really the beginning of June have so far not yielded many gains. And so we have noticed some activity from the Ukrainians that would indicate them preparing for a new push, including the fact that the 117th Brigade, which is a new unit that went through basic this year, and now they're being deployed to the front line in Zaporizhzhia. 117th, they are moving in an artillery battery to the town of Avdiivka and the surrounding areas, so that's about 6 howitzers. And the Ukrainians will also be transferring new equipment from the Avdiivka repair plants, which is from western Ukraine. They have a lot of industrial facilities over there. And they also have a very important rail hub that's been struck multiple times by Russian forces. And so they're moving equipment from Avdiivka all the way to Orikhiv. Orikhiv will be a new hub for equipment that will be dispersed from there to different specific units and to specific geographical locations for their needs. And then we already know that one Buk air defense system was already moved to the city of Orikhiv. And so we know that they're trying to already put up these defenses against potential Russian air sorties, which have proved to be lethal for Ukrainian attacks as they're trying to advance. A lot of Russian air sorties have been coming in and causing havoc for the advancing Ukrainians. But another thing about the cloud cover is that it makes it harder for the Russian air forces to operate. So that is a sort of a double-edged sword for the Russians. But we also have reports that the Ukrainians are utilizing Su-24s and Su-25s, so their air force is not totally dissipated. So there's still Ukrainian activity from the air. It is on a very low altitude, and they're usually launched from these local Ukrainian airfields. In this case, or in Zaporizhzhia, they're coming in from like Dnipro, for instance, this time, which is pretty close to the front line in relative terms compared to a lot of the other Ukrainian airports in the region, so they don't have to fly for that long. You also have towns that are a bit further to the west, like Kropotymsky, which does have a airport over here to the north. It's been hit multiple times by the Russians. And so there's also very small local airfields. I actually have to map them right now because the Russians, I have all of their airports mapped out in Ukraine and out of Ukraine. But for Ukraine, you can see I don't really have many of them marked, so I'm gonna do that definitely. But anyway, these Su-24-25s, they are reaching very close to the front line, within 16 to 35 kilometers of the actual front line. They're showing up above the airspace of towns like Komishiuvaka over here, or the town of Uspenivka. Uspenivka is over here. And also the town of, I don't know if I can find it on the map right now, but there's Zalivny, this town over here. And so the Ukrainians, they are appearing in these areas that, sure, they're not directly on the front line, but they are pretty close to it. And so this shows that even though the Russians have beefed up their anti-air defenses in a lot of these areas near the front line, they are not able to really detect and shoot down every single Ukrainian plane that flies around. Because they are around for a very short amount of time and they try to go undetected. They are sometimes equipped with Storm Shadow missiles. And so those are launched from these areas pretty close to the front line, so they can get targets that are even deeper into Russia. We're seeing already that they've been hitting targets in Crimea, so we're going to have to see more of that. And a lot of it comes from this area around the front line of Zaporizhzhia. And then the Storm Shadows, they have a range of up to around 250 kilometers. And so that's really in terms of Zaporizhzhia. But let's move on to the situation in Donetsk. So we have already talked about the situation yesterday concerning the Ukrainian push towards the town of Putynia. So since then, the Ukrainians have not been able to push from the northeast towards Putynia, but they have been able to push from Rivnopil and Novodarivka directly from the north towards Putynia. So the Russians, even after they lost Rivnopil, they still held some forward positions in some fields directly to the south of the town, but now they've been forced to retreat out of fear of encirclement due to Ukrainian advances on all sides towards the ravines that are to the north of Putynia over here. So this is like the last Russian line of defense before the Ukrainians would reach the town of Putynia. You can see there's like two ravines that are sticking out over here, and so you have some Russian forward positions in that area. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, they are trying to beef up their new positions, their new fields that they took over in order to prevent a counteroffensive and then to begin to push themselves. And so they're mining this area, fortifying it. They're coming in with new ATGM crews to counter Russian columns, and the ATGM crews are also equipped with new grenade launchers. And so they are certainly trying to plan something in this direction. It could be a push to the east around Soromayorsk, or it could be to the west, as I said before, towards Putynia. But now let's move on to the situation around Avdiivka. So the front line has been relatively stable around that area. We talked a few months ago about the Russian gains on the northern flank of Avdiivka, which reached as far as Stepove. But since then, the Ukrainians have gradually been pushing the Russians back in that direction. So, in recent days, the Ukrainians have actually made some pretty sizable gains on the northern flank. First of all, the Russian positions on the northern flank were around this rail line, where you have those two bush lines on either side. And so you can see that the front line has shifted a bit to the east, with the Ukrainians pushing them forward or pushing the Russians back in this area. Not by much, a couple of 100 meters. And they also were able to push the Russians back a bit to the south towards this pond area over here, and then towards these two ponds as well that are around the town of Kamyanka. And so beforehand, the Russians, they had this like forward position over here, which was pretty close to the pond on the northern flank of Avdiivka and very close to the first residential areas in Avdiivka and the coke plant, which is home to many Ukrainian fortified forces. And so they were operating out of these like forward positions on the open fields. And so since then, the Ukrainians have pushed them back a little bit towards Kamyanka and towards Vesele. And so that's the full extent of the Ukrainian gains over there. It is very minuscule in relative terms. It is still significant just because there has barely been any movement there for months. But let's move on to the situation a bit to the north. around the Kreminna front, where I have not really discussed this front that much. It is still important to note that there has been very regular fighting. There's been a lot of artillery duels. And in recent weeks, the Russians have actually begun to push towards the Zherbets River. Zherbets River is over here, if you don't recall. This is where the Russians hope to hold the line because it gives them a bit of a breather and it gives them positions that are a bit farther away from Kreminna and closer to Liman. And so they have been able to really press around this bulge. This bulge is, you could see it's pretty close to Zaporizhzhia, Torske, Yampolivka. So the Russians have been able to really push in this direction, almost reaching those three towns. And then to the south, they are trying to clear out Ukrainian positions, fort positions around the forested areas. And so they've not fully done that yet. It's going to take a while to go through each forested area. It's a very dense place where Ukrainians are utilizing camouflage, so it is very difficult to clear all of it out. But they are on the offensive in this area. They are in the mode of attacking. The Ukrainians are more so on the defensive mode in this specific direction. And the Russians do hold a very firm grasp around Dubrova, which gives them a forward position to attack the Ukrainian positions themselves within the forest. And so that's really it in terms of the front line. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.